Hello and welcome to the Story Nook. Today we'll be reading stories from r/Nuclear Revenge. So go ahead, grab your tea, your coffee, your cocoa, whatever it is you want to drink, curl up in a nice fluffy blanket, and join us as we read these nuclear revenge stories.
Hello, and welcome to Nuclear Revenge. This story is by Ordos Deluxe. I knocked the delusional manager off of his pedestal. I worked for a large global IT company. In my team, we are part of a larger extended team, and an even larger still divisional team. The manager of this division is called Raj. He's based in the States and is what many would call the poster boy definition of a corporate suck-up. According to him, he is in constant video chats with the CEO and has a lot of face-to-face interaction with him. He also appears on much of our division's promotional emails and photographic material, so he's a company-wide recognized person. As for me, I'm a trench-working techie from Scotland. My direct manager is always happy with my performance, and I am somewhat known in our extended team, but not so much in the divisional team. Until this event, which was a while before the COVID outbreak, although I was aware of Raj and his reputation, I had never worked with him directly. I got invited to a company-wide collaboration event in America, which we usually use for technical training and innovation discussion. We got there, and there were some initial social events and meet and greets. Raj was amongst the group, and his general demeanor seemed appropriate for the reputation which followed him. We went into the first day bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I was assigned to a group of 10 people to work on a problem with some coding. All was going well until we came to some group presentations. For our group, a young woman named Natalie was speaking for our results. It all seemed to go okay, but after the session was over, Raj asked to see Natalie out in the hall. From inside the room, we could hear Raj literally screaming at her. Many offensive slurs were used, and we could hear banging on the wall as well. Natalie returned to the room a sobbing mess. Much to the shock of everyone, Raj returned as if nothing happened. This pattern continued over the course of the week. Natalie would single out people for these one-on-one performance critiques. He would go into detail about how work was substandard and how they needed to improve, all while taking group photos for corporate comms for the higher-ups, orchestrating shots to make us all look like one big happy family. I spoke to some of my own team back home about this in my downtime, and it does turn out that this has always been rumored behavior for him. Just no one has ever knew someone who had experienced this before. I don't know what the job culture is like for this role in a place like America, but here we have dignity at work regulations. Performance criticism is fine, but not when you are engaging in ritualistic humiliation of your employees. I knew this is exactly what I was going to do. For the next few days, I made sure that I was delivering more presentations than anyone else, and really making an effort to attract attention. As hope, he asked me for a chat, and pulled me into the hall. He didn't wait for the door to close before starting his rant. Experiencing it firsthand was interesting. He claimed I had no idea what I was talking about, even though it had likely been about 20 years since he had any technical work himself. He was vile, shouting and spitting in my face. I also learned what that banging noises were. He would punch doors and slam his hands on the wall near me as if to try and intimidate me. I was prepared mentally, though, and just smiled and nodded during the entire rant. He looked angry that I was reacting this way, and by the end of it I thought he was legitimately going to burst a blood vessel. When he was finished, I asked him if he was done. He told me to get out of his sight, and that's when I did it. I gave him a Glasgow kiss, and for those unfamiliar, it is a headbutt, and it is not the first headbutt I've delivered in my life. However, having been brought up near Glasgow, He collapsed on the floor in shock, holding his nose, which didn't bleed, unfortunately. Looking up at me, I leaned down, and in my most Glasgowian accent, I whispered to him, "If you ever disrespect me or my colleagues again, I'll kick the other fuck out of you the next time, you cunt." I went back to the room while he did not. Inevitably, I got the HR call. Raj was in the room as well, and I could see that he had 2 black eyes as a result of the headbutt. I was asked to explain myself, and I told the truth, mostly. I explained about his abusive behavior, but focused specifically on the hand slamming and how it had been intimidating to me. It hadn't really, but I masterfully played up the aspect of the encounter. I described the headbutt as a reaction when he slammed the wall right next to my head with his hands. I wasn't sure what story he had told them, but I was sent away after this. I ultimately ended up with a disciplinary on my record, but no further consequences. Other team members were interviewed over the next few days, and once the pattern of abuse was established, Raj was terminated from the company. The most satisfying part of this was the day after, when everyone on the course went out to dinner. Natalie insisted that he stand next to her for the division group photograph, black eyes and all, and I have to think that photograph contributed to his downfall in some way. And that is this beautiful story of I knocked the delusional manager off of his pedestal. Wonderful story. Really, really wonderful. It's fantastic when you can make them taste their own medicine. Beautiful. Welcome to Nuclear Revenge. Never piss off a rich redneck by Effective Fix 3235. This is a story about my grandparents' friends. I was a young teen, but given the outcome, the story has stuck with me. I've sat on the story for a while, but it's so satisfying to see a gaggle of Karens taken down a notch that I figured I'd share. For the sake of the story, we will call my grandparents' friend William. Now, my grandparents knew William from way back. My grandmother knew him from school, and my grandfather met him after marrying my grandmother. Anyways, in the 60s, Grandma was a manager at a 7-Eleven. William led a crew that went there every day. It was the only gas station in a 30-minute radius, so everyone knew everyone in that sleepy coastal town kind of way. Now, one day, William was doing a job down on the waterfront and slipped, fell, and broke his back. While he was healing from the operation and was broke as a joke, my grandma would always make sure to send him something to eat that she'd pay for when the crew would come in to grab their snacks and gas up. Knowing William would simply skip the meal to save the money for his own family. My grandpa also took him to several doctor's appointments since William couldn't drive for a while and his tiny little wife couldn't wrangle him into the car by herself. William never forgot that. 20 years later, when he sold off his now very successful business and was a millionaire about 20 times over, he promptly told 90% of the world to go to hell, but kept those that had always been there for him close. Meanwhile, he never moved from the house that he had since before he was rich. His only concessions to his wealth were trips with his wife to see the world and buying quite a few acres of the forested land around him. If you weren't his friend, you'd take him for every other blue-collar worker in the town. There was obviously nothing obvious to show that he was worth tens of millions of dollars. After his wife died in the 90s, William decided to take up a new hobby. As he lived outside the city limits, he set up a sawmill and woodworking shop, got all the proper permits and everything. The saws were a big, old, enclosed building in the middle of all that land, so in all honesty, so no harm, no foul, right? Wrong. The family that owned the forest behind William's land had just sold it to developers. Thus, the new luxury-gated neighborhood, the first in the area, was born. Enter a plethora of Chads and Karens who were mostly from up north and had moved down south to take advantage of the better weather and the nearby beach. It didn't take long before they decided to take offense to his little business venture on the other side of the 10-foot wall of their neighborhood, because it didn't fit in with the image of their community. You know, the community he was decidedly not a part of, so they sued him. Didn't even try to start a dialogue with him, just up and sued him. William was livid. He was your typical coastal redneck, and he would be damned if those damn Yankees told him what to do with his own property. That was not within city limits, nor located in an HOA. William countered with professional noise studies that showed that some of the kids in that neighborhood drove vehicles that made more ambient noise than his little operation. Note, the people in the neighborhood simply threw more money at the lawyers to continue on with the lawsuit. Essentially, their plan was to bleed him dry. Their lawyers, who were not locals, actually told William's lawyer that he should probably advise his client to close the shop so that he wouldn't end up bankrupt due to the resources being thrown at him from the homeowners. Due to the relatively modest surroundings of his home, the neighbors nor the lawyers had any idea that the man was actually richer than just about all of them put together. All they saw was an older dude who drove a beat-up 80s model truck and wore dicky jeans and wore shirts that lived in what appeared to be a relatively modest home, especially compared to their McMansions. When William's lawyer told him about the conversation, William lost his fucking mind. I clearly remember him screeching into my parents' driveway in that old work truck, cussing up a storm and ranting and raving about before he even got into the house. He came to our house. Why? Because my grandmother, bless her heart, was known as one of the most giving people in the world. Unless you pissed her off. If you hurt her as someone she cared for, she became one of the most vindictive assholes that could be found in that town. I am not kidding when I say that her ability for revenge, served cold, was legendary amongst the locals. So William had come to the house for a dose of her deviousness. Us kids aren't allowed inside during that conversation. But after he left that day, I later heard the adults talking about how he proceeded to hire quite a few private investigators to see if there would be any dirt to dig up on them. By them, I mean the dozens of people in that neighborhood that were a part of that lawsuit. Lo and behold, there was apparently copious amounts of dirt to be had. I still remember him positively crowing about it to my grandparents one fine summer day months later. That 60-something-year-old man was as gleeful as a proverbial kid on Christmas morning. Why? Because after he learned what his little private army dug up, he started making some phone calls to various acquaintances in high places. The ensuing fallout meant that the lawsuit was dropped. There was quite a list of misdeeds that were discovered, but the ones that I heard talked about by the adults that stick with me are: there were more than a handful of individuals that owed back child support. William very helpfully had the private investigators provide the mother's updated address and employment information so that they could pursue said child support / garnishment if they wanted to. On top of that, the IRS became very interested in several of those people as well as various other neighbors. Finally, one household ended up in prison because the investigator realized that they were drug dealers. The pictures of the transactions caught by the PIs were very helpfully handed over to the sheriff's department. Drugs are bad, kid. Moral of the story: never piss off a rich redneck. Edit. Thank you for all the love, fellow Redditors. I didn't expect all of this when I logged back in this morning. And this is a beautiful story, because I live down south. I don't know a lot of rich rednecks, but don't come for us. We do not take kindly to your bullshit. HOAs are stupid. It's fucking stupid. Bitch, I own the house. This is my land. Why you gotta tell me what the fuck I can do with it? Just saying. It's a thing. Beautiful story. Love the story. Fantastic. A+. Nuclear Revenge. The story is by Odin the American. Revenge in the Army. I was in the army, and while away on a 4-day pass, my barracks room was broken into, and a significant amount of my military equipment, helmet, backpack, and weapons, web belt, ammo, carrier, etc., was stolen to the tune of approximately $800 in 1984 dollars. When I returned, there were tool marks on the locker room door, and it was clearly a break-in. I notified my platoon sergeant and first sergeant, and they said to call the military police. Then the company commander/commanding officer, who outranked us, called me and stated he didn't want the break-in being reported to the military police, because then our company would show up in the higher level division police blotter, and this would make him, the company commander/commanding officer, CO, look bad. So he told me to do a report of survey, a form used to be reimbursed for lost equipment, and I wouldn't have to pay for the stolen equipment, whose replacement costs were a month's pay. Well, I submitted the paperwork, and without the police report, my request to be reimbursed was denied, and I was told I would have to pay for all the stolen equipment. I was shocked because it was a lot of money, and I was just about to leave the army to go back to college. I needed that money to survive. The CEO told me that was a tough break, and there was nothing he could do to help me, even though it was his orders I'd follow. Well, it turns out, just a week before we found out that division would not replace my stolen equipment, I had led our company through a nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons evaluation exercise that was my specialty in the Army. And the spineless CO sat out the exercise and just observed. This placed me in a leadership position to do his job while a captain from our division HQ graded our actions. I was a junior sergeant who had to maneuver, lead, and direct the whole company of 120 men, including senior lieutenants, to a staging area 5 miles away, through the security procedures to secure the decontamination site, and then lead the cleaning of our men, tanks, and equipment from the simulated chemical attack. I had never maneuvered an armored company before, but I did it, and the other sergeants and lieutenants in the unit were shocked that the CO hadn't helped me during the exercise. The process went well, and at the end, a captain from the division who was evaluating us congratulated me on doing a good job. In front of the company, this captain then explained our next steps we would do. He made a mistake and told the troops wrong information, that in combat would get them killed. I was leaving the army, but I cared enough about my fellow soldiers to want them to be combat proficient. So politely and respectfully I corrected what the captain had said, but he clearly resented me, making him look silly. I guess he was embarrassed a lower-ranking soldier corrected him, and that made him noticeably embarrassed. At the end of the debriefing, I was walked back to my armored vehicle to radio our HQ that now we had completed our decontamination, a requirement of the exercise, and were operational again. And this captain followed me away from the other soldiers. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I was about to make the radio call to HQ, and he told me that wouldn't be necessary. I could just tell him what I would say. I told him, and he told me our unit had passed the evaluation. Luckily for me, my first sergeant overheard him say this to me. Now fast forward to where I find out that my equipment would not be replaced, and a couple days later, I was called to the CEO's office with my first sergeant and told our company had flunked the training evaluation because I hadn't made the radio call. I was getting out of the army, so didn't really care, but it was bad news for my CO. I was shocked because the other captain, who outranked me, told me not to make the radio call, that our unit was decontaminated and operational again. Turns out that the captain was immature and mad at me since I had embarrassed him in front of all the soldiers in my unit. I still was angry at the CO for ordering me not to call the police about my barracks room break-in, and how he didn't care that I would now have to pay a lot of money to replace my stolen equipment. So I didn't defend myself or tell the CEO what really happened with the evaluation or that captain. When I left the CO's option, the first sergeant told me he heard the other captain tell me not to make that radio call, but not to say anything. Our CO was a jerk who would get us all killed in a war, and his unit flunking the evaluation made him look really bad. So he asked me to keep my mouth shut. A couple of weeks later, the CEO was rude to a sick soldier in our unit while I was out processing to leave the army. Everyone hated him even more for this. So our support sergeant, who was retiring from the army, and the other CEO... Forgot my screen was touchscreen. Here we go. So our supply sergeant, who was retiring from the army, and after the CO signed for all the military equipment in the supply room, told me he couldn't believe that CO had screwed me over on my stolen equipment and that he would help me. So he handed me the keys to the supply room that the CO hadn't collected and told me to take whatever military equipment I would need to replace my stolen equipment. Since the CO was now responsible to replace everything in the supply room with his money, he also apologized that some of the replacement equipment I would need was not in the supply room, and he felt bad I would still have to pay a couple $100 out of pocket to replace some of the stolen equipment. The supply sergeant also answered my questions about where all the backup training logs for our unit's weapons and physical training tests were kept. We were about to be inspected by higher headquarters, and these records were super important for the CEO to pass the inspection and be promoted, and not to be kicked out of the army. The day before I got out of the army with an honorable discharge, and just a couple of days before this huge, important inspection, it was discovered that the whole company's year's worth of weapons training records, the backup records, and the electronic records were missing and wiped clean. The CEO had to explain this embarrassing situation to his bosses, who were not happy with him. His unit had already flunked the NBC evaluation, and now his unit had failed to properly maintain training records. Even worse, his unit's training budget was completely over budget, with cost off the charts, and the division had to come up with a lot of money to cover the ammo cost to requalify the whole company on all of our weapons, plus time from other duties to redo our physical tests, PT, of running, push-ups, etc. Just as bad. Advanced training would have to be canceled to reduce all the basic weapon qualification training that had to be completed once again.
And that is all we have for today on our Nuclear Revenge stories. Please go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, tell me what other kind of stories you want me to read in the future. Feel free to send other stories you want me to read my way. You can send them through my email, which should be listed in the description or on my YouTube channel. Currently I have 5 subscribers. Thank you all for being here. All that good stuff. Make sure to stay hydrated, stay safe. If you're listening on the podcast version, thank you very much. I'm hoping that once we reach at least 1,000 subscribers, I will be able to do this daily. Right now, the goal is just 10, and I would be happy with that. So thank you all very much for being here and supporting me and watching and reading as I create this content. If you're watching the art version on my other YouTube channel, thank you as well. Bye bye.